Okay, so welcome everyone to the third international webinar organized by Századvég Economic Research Institute. This event follows our online discussions, which took place earlier this year. First one at the end of April, and the second on the 31st of August. While our first event in line focused on digital skills and the digital readiness of microenterprises, the second is centered around how companies' behavior responds to existing climate policy goals, or in other words, how companies' business strategies are influenced by consumers' climate-related preferences. Both of them were very interesting discussions indeed. Today, we will focus on de-urbanization and relative and current trends, which we can observe in particular in Hungary. Now, the panel discussion that we're planning will expand the scope of the study that we'll get to know very soon. My name is Pál Belényesi, and I will steer the event today. With the current debate, our main objective is to contribute to the ongoing discussions on urbanization, or de-urbanization for that matter, and the related trends, and perhaps even help better frame cohesion and agricultural policies in the European Union, mainly by supplying the results of our recent representative survey. We do hope that the very first-hand and up-to-date data will enable eventually decision makers to adopt more accurate policies, ones that are better tailored to regional needs in the European Union. Now, before getting on with the event, introducing the speakers and the agenda and so forth, I would like to give the opportunity, almost as a custom by now, to Kinga Kenyeres, Vice President of Századvég, to briefly welcome the participants. So Kinga, please.
Thank you. I would also like to welcome everyone to the third webinar of Századvég. As Pál had mentioned, we will cover today urbanization and de-urbanization processes and their current state, but let me first give you a brief background of our company and the seminar. Századvég Konjunktúrakutató carries out economic analysis and research related to numerous policy fields along its 8 business lines, which include digital economy, social research, energy and climate, development policy, education, macroeconomics, health, and agricultural economy. Our works delivered to our private and public sector clients are complemented by our primary research capacities, which use multiple qualitative and quantitative methodologies, including recent surveying technologies such as social listening or eye tracking analysis. The research presented and discussed today was carried out by our social policy research team. The results not only provide new information to the long-lasting analysis of urbanization trends, but as Pál mentioned, also provide valuable input for policy making. As an introduction to the discussion, Századvég will present selected results of its recent research, which reached out to 60,000 Hungarian adults, which is almost 1% of the Hungarian adult population. As part of our strategy to boost our international presence, Századvég plans to host further webinars and discussions in relevant topics of European public policies in the upcoming year. Also, as part of the discussion on the future of the EU, we would also like to welcome you on those events. But now, please allow me to likewise welcome our guests, Haase from the European Parliament, Mátyás Szabó from European Commission, Bernd Schuh from the Austrian Institute for Regional Studies and Spatial Planning, János Balázs Kocsis, Deputy Head of the Hungarian Society for Urban Planning, and Viktor Worm, my colleague, Századvég Senior Researcher. I'm sure that their reflections will provide a significant added value to our research, And the discussion will be vivid, touching many relevant topics of points of the topic. Thank you for your participation, and I wish you all a great session. Thank you.
Thank you, Kinga. Lovely to have you always with us and listening into the very detailed and technical discussions. So we are aware of the fact that it's close to Christmas, and obviously I wanted to make just a short note on that you know, we should also be getting not only into regional and de-urbanization related policies, but into the Christmas spirit. So that's you know, that's what I can contribute to the discussion. And just to set the tone, it's a nice thing. My daughter made it. Very, very recycled, very creative. So I hope you feel that whatever you are, if it's not snowing, it will be snowing. If you don't want it to be snowing, then it's not going to be snowing. Getting on with the agenda. Now come the dry stuff, right? So housekeeping. We will have an introduction of the study by the authors, or at least one of them. Victor, then we have a panel of 4, and I will introduce the panelists in due course, more in detail whenever the round comes up. And then we will have a round of questions to the participants, and then an open discussion with the audience. Now, if you would like to ask questions, do write your questions in the chat box, which is available on the software that we are using, starting with the indication of whom you are addressing with the question. We will collect them and then pass them on to the intended panelists, or I will moderate that debate. The event is recorded, and it will be made available on the Institute's website. So general disclaimer, if you don't want to be part of it, you have to log out. We cannot single out participants. All presentations will also be made available on the same website. So not only the recording, but the presentations. Now, I would like to briefly give you a very short introduction to the debate. As we know, just to have you with us with the same mindset, even if you're experts. So urbanization has been a preeminent trend for many years, and this fact had essentially materialized in real estate prices, urban jobs, the growth in urban jobs, urban job wages, and their growth as well. Millions have flocked to cities for better lives. In Hungary, for example, World Bank data shows that between 1960 and 2021, urban population has grown by 16%. Nowadays, over 60% of the country lives in cities. Once again, according to UN data, already since 2007, more people have been living in cities than outside of cities. The age has been growing steadily between the two, and the UN recently, a couple of years ago, has projected that by 2050, 2/3 of the world's population will live in cities. Now, but then came the pandemic. We had to and continue to face recurring restrictions concerning our habitual city life. Let that be social vibrancy related, economic vigor, or sports activity. All are characteristics that made cities more attractive. Online work has become a norm, with many people being either obliged or offered the option of home-based operational experience. We are online as well, so this is no surprise to us. Many are of the view that the appeal of big and expensive cities, settlements, is being genuinely questioned. Not everyone shares this, of course, but it's a growing trend. Those who follow Eurostat's degree of urbanization, or the Commission's definition of functional urban area, could notice that the approach to urban lifestyle, de-urbanization, has gone through some changes indeed. Even the markers to qualify urbanization and related trend is a moving subject. Now, with that introduction, what will we discuss, what will we focus on today? We start with the introduction of the recent study, and we will touch upon questions like, what does the recent survey and study tell us about the Hungarian situation of urbanization or de-urbanization? Is urbanization a main trend still nowadays? Has this turned around due to the COVID pandemic? Can we observe a change in people's behavior because of the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, in relation to moving to the cities? Then we'll have a panel discussion, and we'll be trying to find out whether sectoral policies at EU level, of course, reflect these trends. Do they accompany the changing attitude or manifest behavior of the individuals? One panel member will introduce certain social urban concept from a more of a researcher's point of view. We'll hear about the European Parliament's actions in this respect too. And we'll listen to the Austrian considerations. So another CEE experience with probably coming from a country with slightly different social and economic characteristics than Hungary. Now, without further ado, I would ask Viktor Wurm, who's a senior researcher at Századvég, to introduce the research. Viktor, please.
Thank you for your kind words, Paul. And I would like to also welcome all the panelists and audience to our current presentation. I was allowed to present our data in 15 minutes, so let's just skim over them. Kinga has already started the introduction of our research, what we have done. Basically, we have asked about 60,000, not about, exactly 60,000 people in Hungary about their way of life. The main aim of the study was to provide a deeper understanding of the Hungarian rural society, how the different attitudes of people towards rural life look like in the 21st century, in 2021. Basically, today's presentation will highlight some of the main findings of this survey. I would like to concentrate on mobility. So basically, we are going to touch upon urbanization and ruralization both. However, the main emphasis is going to be mobility. So the traditional Hungarian population is considered a little immobile, above average in the European Union. It can be quoted to the fact that about 90% of the population lives in houses that are owned by private individuals. However, looking at the data, what we see is that most cities, towns, and even districts of Budapest has populations that hold the majority of non-native populations. So what we can derive from this fact is that at least once in our lifetime, we usually tend to move to a different settlement, which basically boils down to the fact that patry and matry locality is dissolving in the Hungarian population, and thusly the mobility of the population is becoming better and better yearly. So if we just look at the population's data, we can see what I have told you, that it's less than 50% of the population who are native to the settlement they live in, although the percentages are pretty high outside of the capital, where it is only 1/3 that has been born to the district or the city itself that they are living in right now. Going deeper, the majority does not contemplate, however, the idea of moving. So people do not tend to think that they are really going to move. Basically, those who are sure that they want to move represent only about 1/3 of the population. Higher education tend to mitigate this. So in higher education levels, we find a lower amount of people that are contemplating moving. The interesting thing is that it is so the highest education levels hold the lower percentages, and also the lowest education level. So basically those who have secondary or high school education, they tend to be the more perceptive to moving. And also the willingness to move is higher in younger populations, which in this case is interesting because introducing younger populations into rural regions would refresh, basically would be a blood refression in those regions as well. About ruralization, it was interesting in the study. We found that ruralization and urbanization, if we only look at people who want to move to different settlement types, so from cities to towns or from towns to cities, actually ruralization is a more preferred way of moving than urbanization. Of course, most people tend to try to stay in settlement types that they live in or move towards cities. However, because there are a lot of people living in cities that are contemplating moving to rural regions and suburban regions outside of city borders, this ruralization tends to be higher than the actual urbanization rate. Older populations show a much higher affinity towards this ruralization effect, and also in groups with higher attainment level, the willingness to stay in urban areas is more pronounced. However, as I have said, younger populations have a higher tendency to move. Therefore, the base population is bigger, the moving population there. The main drivers for moving out of the settlement that you live in is basically livelihood and employment. So work and employment is the main driving force of movement. Family can also be an interesting part. Pursuing career plans is the third, but this basically is the same as employment and work. And the actual type of settlement is only in the middle region of drivers or motivators behind movement. So basically, if you have a good infrastructure and good work openings, then the population is willing to move towards that part of location. We also have conducted a few focus group studies in order to be able to see the much deeper and to grasp a much deeper understanding of the subjects. Regarding mobility, the main findings have been that there is a desire to move to rural areas. However, it's much higher in case of Budapest. There were a lot of reasons people tend to explain, but basically the real estate prices in the capital are very high, and self-preservation way of living is what drives the movement from the capital towards the rural areas. There are also family reasons and career plans, which is present in all types of settlements and becomes more important with higher levels of education. Moving to the countryside, because right now we are discussing the countryside and ruralization with a much higher emphasis. The main fact that has kept coming up in these focus groups was the calm, peace of mind, relaxed and much more direct contact with people. So these were the main explaining factors that were basically describing a rural idyll, a very idealized rural living that has been the model in people's minds. And when they thought of these things, that were the point where they would like to move to these towns and settlements. Family has the highest restraining power. So if we are discussing why people don't move, they tend to try to be close to friends and family. And also the attachment to property and real estate. As I have explained, 90% of the population lives in houses that are privately owned. So a lot of times they have mortgages on these houses, and also it's a bit harder to move out of a house that you own than, for example, from a rented flat. Therefore, financial reasons and the attachment to property is also high up on this list. So main restraining forces behind mobility is the attachment to friends, which we already discussed, family centrism. The possibility for career opportunities are more prevalent in urban areas. That is basically the reason why people from urban areas, as we have seen on the previous chart, about 3/4 of the population living in cities doesn't want to move. That is why, because most of the career opportunities are in cities. Aside from a minority in the capital, the population is bound by their tenacity to their real estate. So basically, rentable housing is most prevalent in the capital, and Budapest has the highest bounding power of financial means, under which we mean that the better earning career opportunities tend to be in the capital, or much more prevalent to the capital than to the rural areas. So that is why people tend to stay here. So in reality, it is only about 1/5 of the population who is planning to move, and most of them live in the capital. So previously we have been talking about mobility that is a factor of whether they contemplate moving, so if it comes to their mind, but this is the actual planning. This is more prevalent in the youngest demographic, and also to residents of Budapest and people with at least high school education, or actually people with high school education, so not the tertiary education level. So perceptions and the rural ideal, which we have already discussed, what we see is that most people are satisfied with the settlement they live in. This is also a restraining factor, because why would I move out of a city that I'm satisfied with? In the country, about 60% of the population reported to be satisfied with their settlement. It was better in county capitals and in the capital. However, towns and the smallest settlements were up at the average. So basically the smaller cities were the ones that gave less satisfaction to the people. About the countryside, the Hungarian population voiced a very positive way of thinking about the countryside. So most of the feelings and associations that came up when we were discussing towns and these rural areas were calmness, carefree, delight, happiness, caring, proudness, gratitude. So all the positive things. However, some negative associations also came up, but they were less frequent than the others. So if we look at the associations that come up with the cities and the rural regions, it is visible that they are in fact two sides of the same coin. So basically the positive things with the cities, like comfort, easy transportation, well-supplied job, leisure, culture, and education opportunities, are the things that the rural areas lack. So basically people who are interested in these kind of things tend to choose cities. In the rural areas, there is, according to the interviewees, bad transportation, lack of job opportunities, less shops and services, lack of cultural programs, lack of leisure. However, because of this rural idol, there is still a, let's call them a consumer group who would like to go towards these kind of settlements because they enjoy a slower life, a bit of a tranquility, fresh air, peace, self-preservation, being close to nature and direct contact with other humans, which is basically the opposite in cities because they are crowded, noisy, polluted, associated with bad hygiene. So basically, if you want to be closer to nature, you are much more likely to move to these rural areas. So the main takeaways from the presentation: the Hungarian population remains relatively mobile. About 1/5 is truly mobile. The main driving force behind mobility is career opportunities and livelihood. The main restraints are, however, family, real estate, and also commuting hours has been mentioned because a lot of a big part of ruralization is basically moving out of cities, but still working in the cities. Therefore, you have to commute a lot. And those towns that are closer to cities or the capital tend to be much more preferred. So it's basically a long way suburbanization. As I have mentioned in the beginning, metro and petri locality trends seem to deteriorate. The majority of the population is satisfied with the settlement they live in. The more urban the area, the higher it is rated regarding services it provides. Rural areas, however, and the countryside are considered idyllic places in the minds of Hungarians, although the most powerful association with the countryside is emptiness, which brings about tranquility, which can be restrained for those that do not wish, that are much more into these crowded career and fastness of life. And what we found for the by the end of our research is that the possible targets for a ruralization campaign can be young people moving out. They are basically the ones who take part in the remote suburbanization. And there is also another group, which is an older, well-situated, less financially concerned, white-collar, mostly office workers who can afford to move to these more remote places. They enjoy the relaxed environment and can work on their laptops away from the office. So this was the presentation. Thank you very much. And I would like to yield back the floor to our wonderful hosts.
Okay, well, I thank you very much. I don't know who you were referring to, but I'm going to take that opportunity. So we've seen that this is a massive study, obviously, with 60,000 people being approached, primary data collection, and then the focus groups. So the results that are coming out from this could be very, very useful at all levels of policymaking. Interesting to see that it turns out that although to some extent, sorry. That's my daughter who just arrived from school, the greatness of online working. So the Hungarian Society is a collectivist society with the restraining power. Yes, she's the one who made this. And apparently the people are, population-wise, are influenced by a very known behavioral bias, that is the status quo bias. I'm sure many of the listeners know about it. That we are, once we get used to something, it's really difficult for us to change, whether it's reasonable or not, economically or financially. The next speaker, I would like to invite to reflect on what we've heard, János Balázs Kocsis, who has several teaching professorship positions at the Corvinus University of Budapest and at the University of Technology and Economics. János is also vice head of the Hungarian Society for Urban Planning. Needless to say, is a great expert in what we are discussing. So I'm personally looking forward very much to hear what János, his thoughts are about what we've heard. János, please.
Thank you, Bob. I'd like to just to give because I think the main focus is on a discussion. So just a couple of introductory words, sentences, and factors. What we have seen and what we'll see today. So I think when it comes to the connection between urban and rural, urban and peri-rural, I think one of the major issues we have to deal with, to tackle with, is that it's a very long process, which started, the last phase started probably 150 years ago, at least in Hungary. And I think this is something that we tend to neglect when it comes to analyzing the situation, that we speak about two parallel processes when it comes to these outer areas and urban areas, connection of outer and urban areas. First is this, what I just found this word that the French uses, peri-urbanization, that people migrate from the countryside to the outer areas of cities, that started, especially in case of Budapest in Hungary, in the 1870s. And this was the bulk of the process that expanded the eastern half of Budapest. And suburbanization started way later, when we defined suburbanization as the migration of middle-class people to the outer areas, and it started in the 1910s. And this was going on in larger scales in the interwar period, and in socialism there was some differences, but I tend nowadays to think that actually these processes went on in distorted forms, like suburbanization within the city limits, especially when it comes to Budapest, because in the outer areas there were like a lot of problems, especially with the infrastructure. Therefore, people started to stay within the perimeters of the city, or cities, and there was the sharp gap between rural and urban areas. On the other hand, there was deliberate policies during socialism to strengthen the countryside cities and towns, middle-sized towns. So there was like a big population shift from rural areas to towns, cities, and to Budapest, but to lesser extent to Budapest than in the previous areas. And in some areas, we faced a very serious depopulation of rural areas. Next slide, please. In the last 25 years, we see new poles of growth, new problematic areas arising, so new peripheral areas arising. But I think one of the most interesting things is that this the lessening gap between rural and urban areas and urban sprawl. When it comes to Budapest nowadays, we argue that Vienna and Budapest are of the same size of 4 million people. In case of Vienna, including Bratislava and Sopron and other areas of western part of Hungary and Slovakia. In case of Budapest, basically the central areas of Budapest. So this metropolization effect is very, very strong. It happens in the eastern part of the country, and it's debated whether the Győr is part of which metropolitan areas. But the other thing what we see is that certain areas in the rural landscape have become popular, where people migrated, of people of upper strata. whereas other areas have become less popular. So we have a differentiation of rural areas, and we see something that we may call the gentrification of some rural areas. And the aspect we found in a research a couple of years ago that there's a very strong correlation between identity and the success of a community, especially in rural areas, but again in urban areas. And we have a differentiation of settlements. We have settlements, they could be in very advantageous positions, but they don't seem to work with a very atomized society, whereas we have well-functioning communities scattered in the countries. And we have, of course, underperforming communities. Next slide, please. So this is just some numbers we did a couple of years ago. This was a measurement of all Hungarian settlements above 1,000 inhabitants, about the successfulness and the prosperity. And I think which is what very much interesting is the moderately prosperous and most prosperous communities, where we can see that when it comes to the least prosperous communities, we see that there's a very strong correlation between successfulness and unsuccessful. But in most prosperous communities, this correlation is less strong, that we see that there are communities that are very prosperous but moderately successful, and vice versa. Next slide, please. I think one of the most exciting things nowadays is the effect of migration to the countryside, especially when it comes to these gentrifying rural areas, how these newcomers can be an asset to the local community if they can be involved and if they want to be involved in the local community. And the previous research, the research showed something very interesting that we heard a couple of minutes ago, that there's a very strong idealistic view of rural areas, and many migrants to the rural areas try to re-establish something idyllic, something traditional, whereas they follow a very urbanized way of life. So this mixture of idealistic urban something and very high usage of gadgets and the like, it's a very characteristic movement. For Hungarian viewers, probably you know Vértes Kozma, which is a prime example of such areas. But I think these newcomers are very important when it comes to vitalizing the local economy by with their knowledge of the market, with their knowledge of financial affairs, and with their wider scope, broader scope. In some researches, we have traced very strong effects of such economic activities, strengthening economic activities. And of course, they have a higher demand of local services. And yeah, I think this is it. And I'm going to contribute more to the debate, but I think these are the main key points I wanted to mention. Thank you very much.
Thank you, János. That was it was very interesting, in particular that you mentioned Vértes Kozma. I was there a couple of weeks ago, yeah, it's truly something remarkable. The idealistic, it comes to my mind, the idealistic or bucolic, I'm not sure which one people are looking for. Certainly they see the advantages of country life. I'm not sure everybody is ready for it when it comes to really trying out what it means. So the next speaker, we will move towards more to the policymaking side, and I will ask Diana to give her presentation, who is a public servant. Well, besides the fact that we went to the same university, it turns out, more or less at the same time. So she is a public servant and a research manager employed by the Policy Department for Structure and Cohesion Policies at DG Internal Policies, very long name, European Parliament, supporting the work of the Committee on Regional Development, so DG Regi, since 2014. She has a very deep understanding of policymaking, at least in the European Parliament, but I'm sure in broader terms as well. Before that, for many years, she's been involved in EU cohesion policy issues, assisting the same committee in its legislative work, and also by managing externalized research projects, conducting in-house analysis, and organizing workshops. She joined the Parliament back in 2005 and held various positions ever since in the same institution. So Diana, please, the floor is yours. We are looking forward very much to hear what the Parliament is doing on de-urbanization.
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation and for the short introduction, but I have to make a tiny correction, which is a common misunderstanding. So this is not DG Regio that I work for, which is part of the commission. It's the Regi committee. It's very, very similar, and from zooming out or leaving Brussels perspectives, it's not even probably entirely clear what's the difference. So it's a specialized committee inside the European Parliament on regional issues, and I'm in a service that, let's say, assists this committee. I have also 5 to 7 minutes, so when I prepared the presentation, I realized that the whole research could be conducted on the topic what the Parliament has said or thought or done in rural development and in demographic issues, and the whole topic that the presented research was about. So I decided to take examples, so to show you examples, to make probably give you a broader picture, already using some examples of what role the Parliament plays, which is a very broader and a seemingly very far away presence in this debate. And then I will show you a couple of recent positions. With positions, I mean resolutions, so statements behind which there are votes that were made in plenary, so not statements by individual politicians or the president of the Parliament. Some very important messages in there linked to this debate. And in the end, I will show a few examples of what my department and my team has done in the topic, and some interesting findings in studies. There will be 2 slides in the end where I will not really waste the time with. I put hyperlinks on them because all of our studies and the resolutions, of course, of Parliament are available online. So whatever document I make a reference to, those can be found and read in their entirety. I also put the links to our research work, because 99% of the studies that we conduct are available. In many cases, or some cases, they are also translated. Everything is originally in English, but some of them are available also in other languages. So having said that, just to give you a snapshot of how Parliament comes to the table when it's about rural and urban development, basically it's through the 3 main functions of any Parliament, which is creating legislation, so the legislative framework, being a budgetary authority when it comes to the European budget, of course, and then exercising parliamentary control over these policies. When we talk about rural areas, villages, or territorial development in general, in this case, this would be the European cohesion policy and the rural development policy. Now, in this case, we have the 7-year period for 21 to 27, where Parliament has a co-deciding role. It means that based on what the Commission proposes together with the Member States, Parliament is deciding on different provisions that are going to guide these policies. There's a very big chunk of the EU budget which goes to these 2 specific policy areas, as you most probably all know. So I just want to show you 2 examples, because it would be very, very long to discuss all the positions and the different fights on different elements. One very important point which has been on the table for a long time and is very often part of the debates on European and also the national level, how to streamline different policy areas that have an impact on the territory, in this case, cohesion policy financial instruments, so the funds like the European Regional Development Fund or the European Social Fund interventions with the so-called Rural Fund, the European Agricultural Fund for Rural Development. Unfortunately, there's a step back, or it's seen as a step back in the next 7 years, because between 24 and 20, these funds had a common legislative umbrella regulation, which was trying to streamline them to have similar or at least more coordinated strategic objectives. That one should very easy examples are to facilitate that the different ministries in charge talk a little bit more to each other when it comes to supervision of planning, the type of projects chosen, etc. It did not work out for different reasons. Parliament had a very strong, was very vocal about keeping the rural fund together with other territorial tools. It didn't work. And there was an idea, a position in the negotiation process put forward by Parliament that there's a very big emphasis on rural, urban areas with the so-called earmarking to urban areas inside cohesion policy. So they proposed something similar to rural areas and areas with demographic challenges. There is a new article in the ERDF, the Rural Fund Regulation, that addresses this issue, but the so-called earmarking, so the allocation of a specific percentage of the financial resources did not work out. Nevertheless, there is a general feeling that the issues and the challenges of rural areas are becoming more and more visible and more clear in the political debate, at least on the EU level. The second one is the budgetary authority, of course, the 7-year budget of the European Union, and then every year the annual decision of the next year's budget, and the budgetary control, which means basically an auditing type of activity discharge, we call it. Just one example, not going into details, of course, based on the Commission proposals, it was clear that there was an intention to decrease the European funds available for rural development. This, in the end, was, let's say, countered during the negotiations, and Parliament was very strongly fighting for keeping more or less the same level of budget that was allocated in the previous financial period. And then financial pilot projects. This is something interesting inside the EU budget, that Parliament can propose new ideas that can then be tested usually by the European Commission, who is the executive, to see if there could be new ways, new theories tried out or in practice inside policy. There were actually two. There was also a preparatory action linked to smart villages, which were conducted in 2019 and 2020. It means that there is a small amount of EU resource allocated to these preparatory actions and pilot projects, which then can lead to some development in that given policy area. And this smart and eco-social villages, for example, was quite successful. There was also one Hungarian village called Upony who benefited from one of these pilot projects in smart digitalization. I think also something with artificial intelligence in the field of biodiversity. I'm not 100% aware. I would ask for the next slide, because parliamentary control, basically, apart from the very specific area of budgetary control, and we talk about parliamentary control, we also like to use the word scrutiny, which is basically following up of the implementation of the different policies governed by the different EU level legislation. In this case, so for rural and cohesion policy, this is regulations. And this is done through political debates in plenary or in specialized committees, which do or do not result in a resolution, basically a written position voted by the entire plenary of the parliament. I just will show you a couple, two samples where I also inserted on my slide some of the ideas, and then there are other two about which I will not have time to talk, but I see that I have to speed up. So basically, just to show you, there were different, for example, there was one in 2017 in women and their role in rural areas, specific needs of rural areas and climate change, and then demographic trends in EU regions. just to say two things. One is that there must be attention paid to when it comes to transition to climate change, to the specific needs of rural areas, for example, in terms of smart mobility and how the transport and the mobility in general is organized. The needs might be very different from urban areas. There was a strong call for the rural proofing. I believe another panelist will tell us a little bit more about it. And then, of course, the Commission was praised for the intention to invest more in broadband infrastructure. These are seemingly soft expressions, but they very often try to preempt or reflect on the ongoing planning and the ongoing implementation of cohesion and rural policies in the member states and region. If I can have the next slide. Which I will not say a lot about, just want to mention that there are also intergroups in Parliament. In the very end of my presentation, you will find the link when it can be checked what type of debates they organize. And the Commission recently published a long-term vision for EU rural areas, the work on which is ongoing in Parliament. And there will be a public hearing, which is web streamed. It can be followed online in March, and the resolution for the autumn is foreseen for the autumn. So there's a lot going on in terms of political and policy level debates inside the House at the moment. And another slide just to show a little bit what we do back home in the place where I worked. So there are many studies that are not necessarily that targeting urban or rural areas, but that are very much, and then there are some which are directly, for example, the first one I put up on my side is cohesion policy in non-urban areas, which is basically rural areas. And one interesting finding, what I will now highlight, is how investments already on the planning level are very different in member states, based on member states papers, when it comes to rural or urban areas. So innovation and more innovative economic activity, it can be much more found in those planning papers or plans that target rural areas, whereas when it comes to rural areas, it's usually about how to overcome the disadvantages. So it's much less about how to nurture the unique and diverse local asset. Then the services of general interest in the funding period 14-20, another very, very broad area, talks about what type of model. So there is also the political choices to be made when it comes to migration inside the country. Do we want to dissociate places of production and living and let people move around, or should we focus on economic development around communities that are prosperous? The last example which I want to mention, it was the postal services, where an interesting finding, you can go to the next slide. I will just say one sentence, that one of the findings of that study was that maybe the EU level should not necessarily impose any definition or recommended good practice on member states, because the practices the study brought back are so diverse. So for the EU level, the answer is not always more regulation or even more, let's say, new policy areas or policy aspects, but to maybe collect the practices and let the member states know about those practices, but the decisions to be made at a different level than the EU. Then some more examples I will not mention, and as I said, you can find at the end of my presentation more resources to be read, pages and pages of very interesting examples and debates. Thank you very much. Also, if there's any question, there's my email address up there, so I'm ready to, if somebody feels the need to contact me and ask for details, I can guide you where to find answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Diana. We can see that in spite of the rather limited powers of the Parliament when it comes to this subject matter, the Parliament is neither inept nor shy to come up with resolutions, ideas, researches, studies that everybody can read, rightly so. Rightly so. Thanks for the presentation. I did not want to interrupt after the warning minute. I think it was worth the time. Now, really, without taking too much time, in order to have a nice circle or a straightforward line, as my father used to say, as for a planted seed, you must have a straight line, otherwise it won't come out. So now we move to the European Commission. I will ask Mátyás, who holds a PhD in economics and is an expert at DG Agri of the European Commission, and focuses on obviously rural areas and regional development, urban areas in particular, in relation to social inclusion. He used to be a senior lecturer at the Corvinus University of Budapest, and head of department at the Ministry of Agriculture in Hungary. He's also a member of the Hungarian Urbanistic Society. So Mátyás, please. Floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pal. I hope you can hear me. I see my presentation. I would like to respect the time limit, so I will just go on. First of all, I wanted to tell you that the depopulation, migration, and this topic of newcomers are very much in the heart of the rural development policy of the Commission, and it's manifested and identified also in the most recent long-term vision of rural areas, as Diana also mentioned just some seconds ago. And here in this vision, in this communication on the vision from June this year, we identify key challenges and opportunities, and they are very much related to our topic now. And while I am asking to move to the next slide, I would like to say that during this journey, I think we jumped one slide. I hope I had one more. No, it looks like not. No, I know. Okay, sorry. Yeah, exactly. And we identified and we presented in the communication and the staff working document behind this communication what we know for sure without a doubt. And this is the main figure on this regard, and this is the average annual net migration rate between 2014 and 19. And you will see, I will always mark the Hungarian data based on the Eurostat data. And here you can see the migration net rate. Hungary shows one of the most classic, I would say, or lecture book sample where the rural rate is lower than the zero. It means that it is not that positive, and the urban and intermediate regions have a positive net migration balance. But on EU in general, EU level, we have to see that all three type of regions have positive net migration rate, but always the rural areas have the lower rate. Please step to the next slide. In the journey to this vision, we had a specialized Eurobarometer research, and I wanted to share with you the main and most related data on this, because they have very nice elements which can be seen as additional to the Századvég research. I must highlight here that this research was made in this year as well. So it means that at least 2 waves of the COVID were already behind us. So it will be it has an impact on the results. Please step to the next slide. I will show here, as I said, the most relevant research data of this. And while you see, for example, here the question consider to moving to more or less to rural areas or not, which is the basic motivation about the basic motivation to move rural areas or not. You can see the disaggregated data. I have to tell you that most probably on this picture on this slide, and on the next one, please, on the next one, where you will see the member states disaggregation, and the next one, the most important elements of attractiveness of rural areas and needs in rural areas, in consideration to move there or stay where you are. It's important to see that you will see as expert and stakeholders on this field and terrain that these elements are not only the terrain of intervention of the agriculture funds, but also on the regional development fund and social fund is also has a quite big portion of responsibility when it comes to support of this these elements. I understood the presentation will be shared with you, so I'm not going to speak about the details. You can later check which age group, which element, which disaggregation by gender or education is interesting for you. But I must assure you that also based on these researches and communication, the final Common Agriculture Policy Strategic Plan Regulation give the possibility the support of this element. So most of them, they can be supported by Common Agriculture Policy if, of course, the member states decides to go for it or to do so. So it's under shared management. So it means the member states they have quite a big freedom of movement on what to finance from the Common Agriculture Policy. But I must say, if we move to the next slide, this is also an important questions in this Eurobarometer, and I would like to link here to what János just said about the differences between rural areas, because and as I said, the net migration rate is not that high in rural areas that it would be able to compensate the natural loss of population. So this is one fact I would like to raise your awareness. This is one point. So we face depopulation all around Europe in rural areas. Additional to this, we see very different rural areas also affected differently by the COVID. And we have to see that the most recent evident signals which show some kind of trend change on migration into or towards rural areas are very interesting, but they put on our agenda and in our focus also the question of newcomers, which was also already mentioned, because it will be very interesting to see which rural areas will be more on the target zone of newcomers. How to keep them? This is a very interesting policy question for many experts and all the EU funds, because most of them must contribute here. What kind of elements, if you see the question 3, for example, transport or economic needs, etc., what we do have to deliver there. It's a very interesting topic, and we will see it. But we have to see that there won't be not all the rural areas won't be on this target zone, and I hope we won't find ourselves in a situation that more remote rural areas will and the population of those rural areas will left yourself even more left behind. Because already now we can see that in general level, in the all correspondence level, the people who have felt left behind are less than those who think they are not left behind. But if you see the remote rural areas, the picture is different. So the peripheral rural areas with less connectivity, accessibility to services, it even matter is digital, not matter that it's digital or not, basic services, any kind of infrastructure. So the gap here, I hope, won't be bigger, and we all have to do a lot on this to avoid this situation. As I said, we will see this later. The evidence are not there yet on EU level, for sure. We see some regional, for example, property and immobile price and economic flow trends and rotation of houses, for example. So we will see. We don't have the general view yet. I hope we will get it soon, and we will have a lot of things to do with this. But as I said, newcomers and how to keep them, how to attract them, will be a key question of the next period, also under the Common Agriculture Policy. It's a key challenge for also from the point of generational renewal between the farmers, for example. So we are interested to do this. So thank you for the attention. I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to discuss it with you later in the panel. Thank you, Pál.
Mátyás, thank you very much. Very interesting, very thoughtful, and policy intertwining presentation. It's interesting to note that what the Common Agricultural Policy, in particular its reform, is doing or planning to do in terms of rural areas. And also that although there's a lot of support, it's at the end, it's the member states which decides whom to allocate and to what exactly, whether it goes to digitalization or intergenerational issues and so on and so forth. So with that, we will come back to Hungary, or at least closer to Hungary, and I will ask Bernd to tell something of his immense experience, more than 30 years of work in the fields of environmental economics, regional and agricultural economics, and regional development. Bernd, he participated in various large-scale projects at European and transnational level, dealing with European policy, in particular with innovation, agriculture, comparative territorial analysis, and so on and so forth. Both he's worked with the Committee of Regions, European Parliament, and European Investment Bank. He is from Austria, and he works as Kinga introduced for a regional development think tank in Vienna. Bernd, sorry, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks a million, and thanks for having me again. Yeah, I am going without much delay into a different perspective. I don't know, I hope you have received my latest version. I sent it just during the event, but I guess you should have it, otherwise
I hope I am having the good one. It's not
super, thanks.
And we will change it.
Thanks, Benjamin. So what I'm going to do is actually take a little bit a step back, but also I will kind of hook on to what Mátyás just said. And giving, so to say, the other side of the same coin. I mean, while Mátyás and also Diana were concentrating very much on this Europe rural perspective, I will kind of point out in a couple of pictures, actually, this more urban side of the coin, where we would not necessarily corroborate to what was said in the introduction. That a de-urbanization can be very much observed. Of course, I have to also admit that all the pictures I'm showing you from especially two projects we have been conducting for the European Spatial Observatory Network, for ESPON, are not covering the period of COVID, so not post 2019, because the statistical data is not there. So please, yeah, go to the next slide. So what we can see, first of all, is of course an analysis of how did land use change happen, and that's already telling us very much about urbanization, de-urbanization, or how we use it. And when we looked at the changes between 2000 and 2018 in this case, we can easily see that roughly more than 570,000 hectares were given up for various other purposes. And they were mainly flowing into the urban fabric. So meaning that here the built-up urban area was increasing rather drastically, also gaining from grasslands and other agricultural areas. But it's also flowing very much into construction work, which is in principle various types of not necessarily industry, but crafts and services. Then we have quite a large share also in the industrial and commercial sector as well, but not that much into infrastructure and urban greenery. So we can see that the changes have been drastic. Next slide, please. And we will have to analyze, okay, now where does this come from? And two ways of doing it you have already shown in your introductions presentation, where you really dig very deep into the motives and into possible changes. What we could only do was really looking into the statistics and see what we can find here. And one way was, of course, looking into the demographic change and in the migration flows, which we did for the Central European area. And there we did something like a crossing of the population density in the net migration. So how many people were flowing in and out of a region, and what was the existing, so to say, density already there. And what you can see easily, of course, in there is that in these dark dots, in these green dark dots, the density and the inflow of people, so the net migration, positive net migration, was the largest, which is not surprisingly, of course, urban areas. So you see Vienna, you see Budapest, you see Prague, and you see other cities in the area, urban or urbanly characterized areas, like in Germany, the Bavarian case. On the other hand, of the extreme, you have then low population density areas with a negative migration. So people flowing out of these areas, which would be these pink areas in the map, where you can see that especially, of course, Eastern Hungary, as well as large parts of Croatia, but also Southern Hungary would be characterized, and large parts of Poland, for instance. So next slide, please. So that is one observation what we can make, that we see, okay, people are moving out. That doesn't tell us anything about motives, of course, but we can see the trend, so to say. And then, of course, we can look into other patterns where what you also were explaining in your introduction presentation is the one of the reasons why you are moving out is work, right? So commuting. And that is what we analyzed as well, and we were combining this, and this is a little bit misleading title here. It's not only cross-border commuting, but it's also internal commuting in the countries and in the regions. However, what you can already see as compared to the last map is, of course, the granulation, the territorial unit of analysis is much larger. Here we could only do that on a NUTS2 scale, whereas the demography changes could be done on a NUTS3 scale. So this is what we can see here again in terms of the coloring is, on the one hand, we were looking into the permeability of the borders. So that's the belt in there where you have a continuum between pink, very high permeability, so the border crossings are very easy, and the light blue ones, which is very hard. And that, of course, then explains a lot about the clustering, what we achieved then for the different NUTS2 regions, where you can see these green ones are actually then the urban receiving areas. So that's the areas where people are commuting to, which is, again, not surprisingly, the large urban areas around Munich, around Bavaria, but also central Poland, of course, and then, not very surprisingly, northern Italy, where you would have these receiving ends. And then you have on the other extreme, you have then the so to say that we have then the classical cross-border commuting areas, which are the pink ones, large parts of Slovakia, but also then of course we can see West Transdanubia in Hungary, which is also not a surprise, the classical commuters to Burgenland for a daily basis to cross the borders here, as of course the border crossing is fairly easy. And then you have the internal commuters, which is the rest of the clusters, which show not a clear-cut pattern, but you have then something like an internal commuting pattern within these areas, partly triggered by centers, but partly just triggered by other factors in there. So next one, please. So we can dig a little bit into these motives and we can create pictures on that. And then I return again to the urbanization part and see, okay, how did then the land use patterns in terms of urbanization change over these decades, so almost 2 decades, 2000 to 2018. And what you can see in this map, for instance, is the daily urban use change, so to say, for Europe. And here again, we succeeded on a NUTS3 granulation. And you can see that the light blue ones is the slowest changes. So the change is depicted in square meters per day of urbanization. So land use change in urban context per day. So that's quite dramatic, right? If you take, for instance, that you have the worst thing is 20,000 square meters per day in the dark red zones. So you have a high degree of urbanization in Poland. You have an equally high degree of urbanization in parts of Spain. And you, of course, have then less high degree of urbanization in Central Europe to a large extent. Also, I mean, the hotspots in Hungary are no surprise around Budapest. But you would have other areas as well. In Austria, it would be then an area around Salzburg, so the border area to Bavaria, for instance. So next slide. So that gave us some picture, and I kept the last and most complicated to the end, which is kind of then a crossing where we try to see how the urban fabric, so to say, changed with relation to the population development. So how far are urban areas really swallowing up people from the outside, so to say. And what you look here is that we have in principle 3 classes. So the lilac ones, so these upper areas would be then the ones where you have an increase in urban fabric. So the urban area is spreading, but a declining population, which is a very bizarre situation. But you see that very, very largely in large parts of Eastern Europe, where actually population from urban areas are not, or from other areas are shrinking. That's what we know. But still the urban areas are expanding in a way. That's a very bizarre and rather strange situation. Then you have the second class, which is these brownish tones, where you have an increase of population, and the increase is higher than this increase of the urban fabric. So this means that these urban areas are swallowing up people, but they are not necessarily doing it by spreading out into the areas. In some cases, this is not possible because of limitations of topography, where like you would see here in the case of Belgium, for instance. But it's also the case where you have that for Scandinavia and for large areas of northern Italy, for instance, but also to some extent in Eastern Europe. And then we have the last class where you have an increase of the urban fabric, and you have a higher, which is higher than the increase of the population. So this means that these are really urban areas, and that's the more pinkish ones and red ones, where you have an urban spread with, of course, going hand in hand with an increase of population, but the increase of urban spread is then higher than this increase. So this means it's again a rather, let's say, space-intensive way of urbanization, which you see there, and that you see in large parts of France, especially, but also in some parts of Poland. and to some extent also in Germany and Austria. Less in Hungary, you don't see this type at all, for instance, which is a good thing in a way, right? So with that, I already wanted to, so that's already the last slide I wanted to show you, just to give you a couple of pictures and flavors how we can depict this urbanization and interlinkages of urban-rural areas. And that with these pictures, actually, we cannot necessarily corroborate the trend of de-urbanization. But we would see that urbanization is just taking different forms now, also in the crisis, so that we have either a rather space-intensive increase of urbanization, or we have urban areas which are more effectively and efficiently dealing with these trends. So that's from my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bernd. That was very interesting to see, and obviously it's based on a lot of data and analysis. I wonder whether the right policymakers have these data, right? So I'm wondering whether common agricultural policies are taking into consideration or regional cohesion policies at European level, or even at national level, not just the attitudes, but the true trends. I mean, I'm pretty sure that in rural Andalusia, in Spain, which you've shown us, where a very intense urbanization is taking place, and in I don't know, around Brașov in Romania, where the daily move per square meter is really negligent, compared to what we've seen there. It's not easy to deal with at European level. Of that, I'm pretty sure, and we've heard it from Mátyás. Now we are at the light, at speed light, getting close to the end of our time, and I personally already have a lot of questions that I would have wanted to ask, but perhaps one question. I we are aware of the fact that we're getting close to Christmas, and it's dark outside, but we had thought that this discussion is worth still having this year, and perhaps build on it next year. It could have been a day-long event. We decided to have it in an hour and a half, just to give the audience the sense, and also to ourselves the understanding of what the others are doing. So I would like to ask one, perhaps maybe two questions, but the general question is, of course, is a regression to rural living a plausible perspective or not? This is more of, at the philosophical level. I'd really like to know what you think, the panelists and Victor yourself. But still the main question is that, according to the study, the main motivation for changing place of residence is essentially work, right? It's been almost 2 years that the concept of home office has become more of a fact than just a trendy impression or a goal. How does this phenomenon change to effective home office affect mobilization? Does it at all? Do, for example, the quest for a simpler lifestyle, idyllic, bucolic, health wave, have a noticeable effect on urbanization? What do you think? So if 1 minute, and I wouldn't like to interrupt, it's really not nice, but everybody, 1 minute, just what you think as a general conclusion.
I know 1 minute is very short, but what I would like to say is that we don't know. What we see is that there's a new wave of suburbanization. What we see is that people in a certain career with a certain jobs are able to relocate themselves and go back to work like once a week, something like that, like architects. But they have been doing that for ages. And I think this type of migration to the countryside had started way before the pandemic, and I think it just strengthened the present courses. And I think we have seen a parallel re-urbanization that we can make called gentrification in general, and we have seen suburbanization and peri-urbanization or even rural gentrification before that. And I think this has, these tendencies have strengthened, but it's very early to say whether it's in the long run. Because certain economic activities, especially like creative activities, require personal connections on large scale. And it is possible that there are instances in areas with good infrastructure, these locations are present or will be present, but we don't know yet because it requires huge investments in rural areas.
Okay, thank you. Victor, what do you think?
Yeah, funny you should ask, because we just did a secondary analysis on this 60,000 data set, and we actually looked into distance working and home office. And what we see is that there is a certain group of people that are willing to move to the countryside and work from there. This is basically the office, the middle management office workers. However, the real impact of home office is not very high. So it definitely does something to the willingness to move towards the countryside, and there is a certain group, well, a minority of people who are motivated by it, but it's not the main effect that is driving ruralization.
Thank you. Diana, what do you think? Is there also an instrument, in your opinion, that is missing at European level that could better answer this question, or that could move forward either de-urbanization or urbanization?
I think there's a galaxy of instruments at European level, which also give quite a broad flexibility to member states and regions. Probably the demographic question in general needs to come a little bit more in the forefront. That was also, just to go back, one of the let's say the requests of the European Parliament, that in the debate about the future of Europe, this specific issue should be in the forefront, also the issue in relation to rural areas. And I can just join János, what he has said, that we don't know at the moment. There's also a time lag in population data, so we need to see what's going on in the territory. And indeed, the impact of the COVID and teleworking, also digitalization, in which directions, if we are going to have a future full of smart villages, depending still whether they are, how far they are from smart cities, that would be a very different perspectives than farther away villages with less access, either digitally or in mobility terms to, let's say, more prosperous areas or areas with more possibilities. It's a bit of a blur.
Okay, thank you, Mátyás. What do you think? What does the Commission think?
The Commission thing, I would not say, but my personal and professional view is on that, and I say it with my sociology vein in mind, that this is very much the whole process of to move to rural areas is very much depend on the personal life situation. I mean, and the policy has to be ready to answer this question. Just the stages of life. With small children, it's okay, and it's nice to be in rural areas, but with teenager, for example, it's not that okay, not that easy. But closing to the pension time, it's again very nice to move there. This is for me, it's quite clear, and we need to answer these needs or requests on policy level with specialized services, specialized additional infrastructure, etc. So childcare, long-term care, a lot of things is needed there, and but we have to see the overview. We have to have, and I also support this view that the impact of COVID on this is still unknown. As I said, we see some evidence on a regional level how people are moving, but the whole European level as such is in blur, as Diana just said. And there will be for sure rural areas which won't see the positive impact of this, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you very much. By the way, in America, the Visa has carried out research, and they found no hardcore evidence that even from megalopolises, right? So large urban metropolitan areas, San Francisco, New York, Chicago, people have moved out. They have moved outer, but not out from the cities. So that's a very recent and observable trend because of COVID, right? So Bernd, what do you think? Are we going to go back to a rural lifestyle?
I mean,
1600s?
to answer the two parts, so in terms of home office and stuff, I mean, there is a clear evidence already, like you were just saying, and like János was also saying, I would corroborate to that and say, yes, there is a new kind of suburbanization. This is not meaning that people are completely moving out of cities. I mean, what we can already observe is, of course, that the pressure from the companies themselves will kind of increase this. I mean, we see now huge service enterprises like banks, like insurance companies, who do not provide anymore a working space for every single worker. It's clear that office space is reduced, and that's already a trend. You can already observe that in urban development areas, that large companies have actually only 1.5, so to say, working spaces for 2 workers in a way. So this means that not everybody can go every day to the office anymore. It's physically not possible. So this means that some share of these kind of home working schemes will prevail. That's for sure. And then to come to the second part in terms of the questions, okay, what kind of instruments? That all the pictures I have shown are actually a little bit depressing on this side, because although I fully understand that when Mátyás and Diana said, yes, the EU can provide instruments in terms of supporting certain stuff, everything which deals with spatial planning and zoning is, of course, still out of their hands. They cannot intervene in how much and how large settlements are growing and how much land is taken for settlements or industrial use. That's completely out of their hands. That's the matter of the different member states, and mostly in federal countries, in the provinces, or even in the villages or the municipalities. And there, I think you need to have a rethinking of attitudes and a rethinking of especially of being aware of land use changes. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I can see that Mátyás must add something to that. I would have also said that through the agricultural policies, the European Commission is doing a lot on reuse of land, reclassification of lands, through other policies, the renovation wave of instead of building new buildings, let's renovate existing buildings. And we know that 80% of the building stock that is needed in 2050, we already have that. I think it's a very, very moderate estimate. I think we have that much more than that. It's just that a certain lobby is very strong at European level, and as we've seen it. Now, Mátyás, you wanted to say really just one sentence?
Just to additional to what you just said, yes, the agriculture policy, I think it has an impact on the territorial spatial planning. Of course, agriculture policies always will be on focusing on agriculture, soil and field. Our policy is clear. This soil has to be safe for food production, and this huge support system is very much put make the people more interested in, hopefully, in agriculture production than in building houses or urban areas. But yeah, I agree that based on the law, the competencies are on the national and regional and federal levels as well. But it's clear.
Okay, thank you very much. I very, hiddenly, I have inserted a question to Diana's question, which has come up in the chat. We won't have time for more. I'm very sorry this debate could have gone on much longer, but I think we need to cut it now. Bente, please nod if I'm right. Yes, we started a bit later. I've given a couple of 5-6 extra minutes to the conversation, but let's respect the time. So I would like to thank really wholeheartedly to everyone who was present and contributed to this debate. I wish we could have gone on. Out of personal interest as well, being very egocentric as we all are as human beings, but also because we have a very evident amount of knowledge here by the panelists and the presenter that is worth listening to and sharing at a much longer period of time. So thank you very much once again. Also, name of Századvég, and I am wishing you happy holidays, COVID-free, easy travel holidays. It's not, but let's just wish for it. And I'm hoping to see you next year in our next webinar. So enjoy the mistletoe. Don't stay under it too much. You know what it happens then. So, yeah, happy holidays, really. Thank you.
Thank you and Merry Christmas for all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Merry Christmas.
Happy holidays. Sziasztok.